The morning sun painted golden streaks across the marble floors of Valdoria Palace as King Alexander III walked through the grand corridors. His footsteps echoed softly against the ancient walls that had witnessed centuries of royal history. At 62, the king still carried himself with the dignity and strength that had made him beloved by his people for over 3 decades. His silver hair caught the light streaming through the tall windows, and his deep blue eyes held the wisdom of a ruler who had guided his kingdom through both prosperity and hardship. The kingdom of Valdoria stretched across fertile valleys and rolling hills, home to nearly 8 million souls who looked to their king for guidance and protection. Alexander had inherited a stable realm from his father and had worked tirelessly to expand trade, improve education, and maintain peace with neighboring kingdoms. His greatest pride, however, was not the prosperity of his lands but his family, particularly his eldest son and heir. Prince Edmund, at 34, had grown into everything a future king should be. Tall like his father but with his mother's gentle nature, he possessed a sharp mind for politics and a genuine care for the common people. He had spent years traveling throughout Valdoria, learning about farming, trade, and the daily struggles of ordinary citizens. The people adored him, often saying that Prince Edmund would be an even greater king than his father. Queen Isabella joined her husband in the breakfast chamber, her graceful presence filling the room with warmth. Even at 58, she remained strikingly beautiful, her auburn hair now streaked with silver, and her green eyes still sparkling with the intelligence that had first captured Alexander's heart 40 years ago. Their daughter, Princess Catherine, 28 and unmarried by choice, preferred books and scholarly pursuits to court functions, though she dutifully attended royal ceremonies when required. The royal family had planned to spend this particular morning reviewing preparations for the annual harvest festival, a celebration that brought together people from all corners of the kingdom. Prince Edmund was supposed to return from his diplomatic mission to the neighboring kingdom of Astoria the previous evening, but his arrival had been delayed by weather. Alexander felt a slight unease about his son's absence, but dismissed it as typical parental worry. Lord Chancellor William Hartwell entered the chamber with his usual measured steps. A man in his 70s, he had served the royal family for over 4 decades, his loyalty absolute and his counsel invaluable. His weathered face usually bore a calm expression, but this morning Alexander noticed something different in his old friend's demeanor. There was a tension in his shoulders, a hesitation in his usual confident stride. "Your Majesty," Lord Chancellor Hartwell said, bowing deeply. His voice carried an unusual tremor that immediately caught Alexander's attention. "I must speak with you privately. It is a matter of utmost urgency." Queen Isabella looked up from her correspondence, sensing the gravity in the Chancellor's voice. Princess Catherine, who had been quietly reading at the far end of the table, also raised her eyes from her book. The atmosphere in the room shifted subtly, like the moment before a storm when the air becomes heavy and still. Alexander set down his teacup, the delicate china making a soft clink against the saucer. His years of experience as a ruler had taught him to recognize when serious news was approaching. The way Lord Chancellor Hartwell avoided eye contact, the slight trembling in his usually steady hands, the formal tone despite their long friendship, all these signs pointed to something grave. "Speak freely, William," the king said, though his voice remained steady. "We are family here." Lord Chancellor Hartwell's eyes darted to Queen Isabella and Princess Catherine before returning to the king. "Perhaps it would be better if we spoke in your private study, Your Majesty." The suggestion sent a chill through the room. In all his years of service, the Chancellor had never requested a completely private audience during family time, unless the news was catastrophic. Alexander felt his heart begin to beat faster, though he maintained his composed exterior. "Whatever you have to say can be said here," Alexander replied firmly. "My wife and daughter should hear whatever concerns our kingdom." The Chancellor's face grew pale and he wrung his hands behind his back. He had delivered difficult news before, reports of failed harvests, threats of war, economic troubles. But this was different. This was personal, devastating, and would shake the very foundations of the royal family and the kingdom itself. "Your Majesty," he began slowly, his voice barely above a whisper, "I have received word from Captain Morrison, who was leading Prince Edmund's escort back from Astoria." Alexander's blood ran cold. The mention of his son's name in connection with urgent, private news could only mean one thing. He gripped the arms of his chair, his knuckles turning white, but his expression remained controlled. Beside him, Queen Isabella had gone completely still, her face draining of color as she understood the implication. "Continue," Alexander commanded, though every fiber of his being wanted to stop the words that were about to shatter his world. Lord Chancellor Hartwell took a deep breath, his own eyes filling with tears he had held back during the long, terrible journey to deliver this news. "There was an accident, Your Majesty. A bridge collapsed during the storm 3 nights ago. The prince's carriage." He paused, struggling with the words that would change everything. Prince Edmund did not survive. The words hung in the air like a death sentence. Time seemed to stop in the breakfast chamber. The golden sunlight that had seemed so warm and hopeful moments before now felt cold and mocking. Alexander stared at the Chancellor, his mind refusing to process what he had just heard. This had to be a mistake, a terrible misunderstanding. His son, his heir, his pride and joy, could not be gone. Queen Isabella's sharp intake of breath broke the silence, followed by a sound of anguish that seemed to come from the depths of her soul. Princess Catherine dropped her book, the pages scattering across the floor as she reached for her mother's hand. The King of Valdoria, who had faced armies and political crises with unwavering strength, felt his world crumble in an instant. The breakfast chamber that had moments before been filled with morning warmth now felt like a tomb. King Alexander sat motionless, his strong hands gripping the armrests of his chair so tightly that his knuckles had turned white as bone. The words "Prince Edmund did not survive" echoed in his mind like a cruel refrain, each repetition driving the terrible reality deeper into his consciousness. Queen Isabella's composed demeanor shattered completely. The woman who had stood beside her husband through countless state ceremonies and royal obligations, always maintaining perfect dignity, now wept openly. Her shoulders shook with sobs that seemed to come from the very core of her being. Princess Catherine, despite her usual preference for solitude and books, immediately moved to comfort her mother, though tears streamed down her own pale cheeks. Lord Chancellor Hartwell remained standing, his aged frame bearing the weight of having delivered the most devastating news of his long career. He watched his beloved king wrestle with grief that no amount of royal training could have prepared him for. Alexander had always been a pillar of strength for his kingdom, but now that pillar was cracking under the weight of unimaginable loss. Minutes passed in agonizing silence, broken only by Isabella's quiet weeping and the distant sounds of palace life continuing outside the chamber. Servants went about their duties unaware that their world had just been forever altered. Gardeners tended the royal roses, guards changed shifts at their posts, and kitchen staff prepared for the day's meals, all blissfully ignorant that their beloved prince would never return home. Finally, Alexander spoke, his voice hollow and strange. "Tell me everything, William. Every detail. I need to understand what happened to my son." The Chancellor nodded solemnly, having anticipated this request. He had spent the entire night gathering as much information as possible, knowing that the grieving father would demand answers. Captain Morrison's report states that the diplomatic mission to Astoria concluded successfully. Prince Edmund had secured the trade agreement we discussed, and relations between our kingdoms have been strengthened considerably. Alexander nodded mechanically. The diplomatic success that would have filled him with pride just hours ago now felt meaningless. Trade agreements and political victories paled in comparison to the loss of his firstborn son. They departed Astoria on schedule 3 days ago, the Chancellor continued. The weather had been poor, with heavy rains causing rivers to swell throughout the region. The Millbrook Bridge, which the prince's party needed to cross, had been damaged by the storm but was still considered passable by local authorities. Queen Isabella looked up through her tears. "Millbrook Bridge? We've crossed that bridge dozens of times during our travels. It's ancient, but it was always sturdy. The recent storms were unlike anything the region had experienced in decades, Your Majesty," Lord Chancellor Hartwell explained gently. The foundation stones had been weakened by the flooding. When the prince's carriage and escort attempted to cross, the structure gave way. Alexander closed his eyes, trying not to imagine his son's final moments. Edmund would have been thinking of home, perhaps planning his report on the successful negotiations, looking forward to seeing his family again. The king's throat tightened as he pictured his son's excitement about returning with good news, only to meet such a tragic end so close to home. "How many others?" Princess Catherine asked quietly. her scholarly mind automatically seeking complete information, even in the midst of grief. Captain Morrison and 2 guards survived by jumping clear when they heard the bridge beginning to collapse, the Chancellor replied. Prince Edmund, his personal secretary Lord Fairfax, and 4 other guards perished in the fall. The carriage was found crushed beneath the stone rubble at the bottom of the gorge. The full scope of the tragedy began to sink in. 7 good men had died, including not only the heir to the throne but also loyal servants who had families of their own waiting for their return. Alexander thought of Lord Fairfax's wife and young children, of the families of the guards who had died protecting his son. Their grief would be as real and devastating as his own. Isabella wiped her eyes with a handkerchief, struggling to regain some composure. Where is Edmund now? Where is our son? Captain Morrison and the survivors remained to recover Prince Edmund and the others. A royal escort is bringing them home, Your Majesty. They should arrive by tomorrow evening, weather permitting. The practical arrangements that needed to be made began to crowd into Alexander's mind, though thinking about them felt like betraying his grief. There would need to be a state funeral, official announcements, diplomatic notifications to other kingdoms. The harvest festival would need to be cancelled. Most importantly, the question of succession would arise, though that felt too overwhelming to consider at the moment. Alexander stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the marble floor. He walked to the tall windows that overlooked the palace gardens, where autumn flowers bloomed in brilliant colors. Everything outside looked exactly the same as it had an hour ago, yet his entire world had been transformed. The knowledge that Edmund would never again walk through those gardens, never again laugh at family dinners, never again offer his thoughtful counsel on matters of state, seemed impossible to accept. The people will need to know, he said finally, his voice stronger than he felt, but not yet. Give us today to process this ourselves. Tomorrow we will begin making the necessary announcements and arrangements. Lord Chancellor Hartwell bowed. Of course, Your Majesty. I will ensure that only essential palace staff are informed for now, and they will be sworn to secrecy until you are ready to make a public announcement. Queen Isabella rose unsteadily from her chair, her usual graceful movements now faltering. I need to go to his rooms. She couldn't finish the sentence, but Alexander understood. The need to be close to their son's belongings, to touch things he had touched, was overwhelming. Princess Catherine took her mother's arm supportively. I'll come with you, Mother. As the 2 women left the chamber, their quiet footsteps echoing in the hallway, Alexander remained at the window. The king who had ruled with wisdom and strength for over 30 years felt more lost and helpless than he ever had in his life. The future that had seemed so certain, with Edmund prepared to eventually take the throne and continue their family's legacy, had been destroyed in a single moment of collapsing stone and rushing water. Outside, life in the kingdom continued unchanged. But within the walls of Valdoria Palace, everything had stopped. The royal family's world had been shattered, and Alexander wondered if it could ever be whole again. Later that afternoon, King Alexander found himself alone in his private study, a sanctuary he had always considered his refuge from the demands of ruling. The room was lined with leather-bound books, maps of the kingdom, and portraits of previous kings of Valdoria. On his massive oak desk lay the documents he had been reviewing that morning, though they now seemed to belong to another lifetime. The silence in the study felt deafening. Usually, Alexander appreciated these quiet moments to think and plan, but now the stillness only amplified his grief. He picked up a letter that had arrived the previous week from Prince Edmund, written during his stay in Astoria. His son's familiar handwriting, confident and flowing, covered the pages with observations about the neighboring kingdom and optimistic predictions about the trade negotiations. Father, I believe we can secure an agreement that will benefit both kingdoms greatly, Edmund had written. The King of Astoria speaks highly of our agricultural innovations, particularly the new irrigation systems we implemented in the southern provinces. I am confident that we can establish a partnership that will last for generations. Alexander's hands trembled slightly as he read his son's words. Edmund had always been forward-thinking, always considering how his actions would affect the kingdom decades into the future. The irony that he would never see those future generations was almost unbearable. A soft knock at the door interrupted his thoughts. "Come in," he called, his voice hoarse from suppressed emotion. Lord Chancellor Hartwell entered carrying a leather portfolio. His usual brisk efficiency had been replaced by a gentleness that spoke to their decades of friendship, beyond their professional relationship. Your Majesty, I apologize for disturbing you, but there are matters that require your attention. Alexander gestured to the chair across from his desk. Sit, William. We have much to discuss. The Chancellor settled himself carefully, opening the portfolio with obvious reluctance. First, regarding the official announcement. Word is already beginning to spread among the palace staff, despite our efforts to maintain secrecy. By tomorrow, rumors will likely reach the capital city. I believe it would be wise to make a formal announcement before speculation takes hold. Alexander nodded, though the thought of publicly acknowledging his son's death felt like admitting defeat against hope. Draft an announcement. Keep it simple and dignified. The people loved Edmund. They deserve to know the truth from us, not from gossip and rumors. Already prepared, Your Majesty, Hartwell said, producing a document from his portfolio. I took the liberty of drafting several versions depending on how much detail you wish to share. As Alexander read through the proposed announcements, memories of Edmund flooded his mind. He remembered the day his son was born, how the tiny infant had gripped his finger with surprising strength. He recalled Edmund's first riding lessons in the palace courtyard, the boy's determination evident even at age 6 as he refused to cry despite numerous falls. There was the day Edmund had officially become heir apparent at 18, standing tall and proud during the ceremony while trying to hide his nervousness from the assembled nobles. More recently, Alexander remembered their last conversation before Edmund departed for Astoria. They had discussed the trade negotiations, of course, but also spoke about the future of the kingdom. Edmund had expressed concerns about the growing wealth gap between nobles and commoners, proposing programs to improve education and create more opportunities for advancement among the lower classes. He would have been a better king than I ever was, Alexander said quietly, not realizing he had spoken aloud. Lord Chancellor Hartwell looked up from his papers. Your Majesty, Prince Edmund learned everything he knew about leadership from watching you. His compassion, his wisdom, his dedication to the people, those were qualities he inherited and developed under your guidance. Alexander appreciated his old friend's attempt at comfort, but the words felt hollow in the face of such devastating loss. What does it matter now, William? All those years of preparation, all those lessons about duty and responsibility, for what? He's gone, and with him, the future we had planned. The Chancellor was quiet for a moment, understanding that his king needed to express his grief without interruption. When he spoke again, his voice was gentle but firm. The future may be different than we planned, Your Majesty, but it is not lost. Princess Catherine is intelligent and capable. She has the same compassion as her brother, perhaps even more so. Catherine has never wanted to rule, Alexander replied. She's made that clear since childhood. She prefers her books and scholarly pursuits to the responsibilities of monarchy. I cannot force the crown upon her. Perhaps not immediately, Hartwell conceded. But circumstances change people. Tragedy often reveals strengths we never knew we possessed. Alexander walked to the window that faced the palace's main courtyard. Below he could see servants going about their duties, gardeners tending to the autumn flowers and guards maintaining their posts. Soon all of these people would know that their beloved prince was gone. The grief that was currently contained within the royal family would spread throughout the kingdom, like ripples from a stone thrown into still water. Tell me about the funeral arrangements, Alexander said, turning back to face the Chancellor. Edmund deserves a ceremony worthy of the prince he was and the king he would have become. Lord Chancellor Hartwell consulted his notes. The cathedral can accommodate the ceremony, though we will need to consider capacity for both nobles and common citizens. Prince Edmund was beloved by all classes of society. I expect attendance to be overwhelming. Then we will hold it in the Great Square, Alexander decided. Set up a platform so everyone can see and hear. Edmund always said that the monarchy belonged to all the people, not just the nobles. His funeral should reflect that belief. They spent the next hour discussing practical details, each decision feeling both necessary and surreal. How do you plan a funeral for your child? How do you organize a ceremony to honor a life cut short, just as it was reaching its full potential? Alexander felt as though he was watching someone else make these arrangements. as if the grieving father and the king were two different people. As evening approached, the chancellor gathered his papers and prepared to leave. "Your Majesty, if I may, take time to grieve. The kingdom has functioned for centuries. It can function for a few days while you process this loss. Your people will understand." After Hartwell left, Alexander remained in his study as darkness fell outside. He could not bring himself to join his family for dinner, knowing that Edmund's empty chair at the table would make the loss feel even more real. Instead, he sat in the growing darkness, surrounded by the familiar objects of his reign, and wondered how he would find the strength to lead his kingdom when he could barely hold himself together. The man who had guided Valdoria through wars and famines, who had negotiated treaties and settled disputes, who had been a pillar of strength for millions of citizens, felt utterly powerless against the simple, terrible fact that his son would never come home. Dawn broke gray and somber over Valdoria Palace, the overcast sky seeming to mirror the morning that had settled over the royal family. King Alexander had spent most of the night staring out his study window, unable to sleep, unable to escape the crushing reality of his son's death. When the first rays of sunlight struggled through the clouds, he realized that this was the first sunrise Edmund would never see. The palace corridors buzzed with hushed conversations as servants and staff learned the devastating news. Cook Mary, who had prepared Edmund's favorite meal since he was a child, wept openly in the kitchen. The stable master, who had taught the prince to ride, sat alone among the horses, his weathered hands shaking as he remembered the young boy who had spent countless hours learning to care for his mount. By mid-morning, despite all efforts to control the information, word had spread beyond the palace walls. Palace guards returning home after their shifts carried the news to their families, and from there it rippled outward through the capital city like waves from a dropped stone. Market vendors spoke in whispers, shopkeepers closed their doors early, and mothers pulled their children closer as they tried to explain that their beloved prince was gone. Queen Isabella had not left Edmund's chambers since the previous afternoon. She sat in his favorite reading chair, surrounded by books he would never finish, clothes he would never wear again, and papers covered with his thoughtful notes about kingdom policies. Princess Catherine found her there, still in the same dress she had worn to breakfast the day before, her face pale and drawn from grief and exhaustion. "Mother, you need to eat something," Catherine said gently, setting a tray of tea and light pastries on the small table beside the chair. "Edmund would not want you to make yourself ill." Isabella looked at her daughter with red-rimmed eyes. "How can I eat when he never will again? How can I think about such mundane things when my firstborn is lying cold somewhere on the road home?" Catherine knelt beside her mother's chair, taking her hands. Despite her own grief, she recognized that Isabella was drowning in sorrow and needed support. "Because Father needs us to be strong. Because the kingdom needs us to be strong." Edmund spent his whole life preparing to serve others, even in the face of personal sacrifice. We must honor that by not abandoning our own responsibilities. The wisdom in her younger daughter's words surprised Isabella. Catherine had always been the quiet one, more interested in scholarly pursuits than royal duties. But crisis was revealing a strength and maturity that had been developing unseen. Meanwhile, Alexander struggled with the most basic functions of kingship. Lord Chancellor Hartwell arrived with the morning dispatches, reports that required royal approval, and matters of state that demanded attention. But the king found himself unable to concentrate on trade agreements, judicial appointments, or provincial disputes. How could he care about border disagreements when his son's body was making its final journey home? "Your Majesty," Hartwell said carefully, "the ambassador from Astoria has sent urgent messages expressing King Marcus's deep sorrow over the tragedy. He wishes to know if you would like him to remain in our capital for the funeral ceremonies, or return home to avoid causing additional distress." Alexander stared at the letter without really seeing it. Edmund liked King Marcus. They got along well during the negotiations. His voice was distant, as if he was speaking from far away. Tell him he is welcome to stay if he wishes to pay his respects." Edmund would have wanted that. "Yes, Your Majesty. There are also requests for audiences from several provincial governors who wish to express their condolences personally. And the guild masters have sent petitions asking if they may organize memorial services in their districts." The requests were well-intentioned, but Alexander felt overwhelmed by the prospect of facing crowds of people offering sympathy. How many times would he have to hear, "I'm sorry for your loss," before the words lost all meaning. How many times would he have to accept condolences while maintaining the dignity expected of a king? "Schedule them for next week," he said finally. "After?" "After the funeral. I cannot face such meetings today." As the morning progressed, reports began arriving from throughout the kingdom as news of Prince Edmund's death spread. In the farming villages of the south, where Edmund had spent months learning about agricultural techniques, field workers stopped their harvest activities to hold impromptu memorial gatherings. In the northern mining towns where the prince had worked to improve safety conditions, miners emerged from the depths early to light candles in his memory. The most poignant report came from the Millbrook region, near where the tragedy had occurred. Local residents had gathered at the site of the collapsed bridge, bringing flowers and small tokens of remembrance. An elderly woman who had met Prince Edmund during one of his visits to assess flood damage had walked 3 miles to leave a loaf of bread at the memorial site, explaining that she wanted to feed him one more time even though he was gone. By afternoon, a messenger arrived with news that the funeral procession carrying Prince Edmund's body had been spotted on the horizon. Alexander, Isabella, and Catherine gathered in the palace's highest tower to watch for their first glimpse of the solemn cavalcade, bringing their beloved son and brother home for the last time. The procession moved slowly across the countryside, black banners fluttering in the autumn wind. An honor guard of 50 soldiers surrounded an ornate carriage draped in the royal colors of deep blue and gold. Behind them rode Captain Morrison and the survivors of the bridge collapse, their faces grim with the weight of their survival when their prince had not been so fortunate. As the procession drew closer to the palace, crowds began to gather along the roadside. Common citizens, nobles, merchants, farmers, and craftsmen stood in respectful silence as their future king made his final journey home. Many wept openly, others stood with heads bowed, but all seemed to understand that they were witnessing a moment that would forever change their kingdom. Alexander gripped the stone windowsill until his knuckles turned white. Seeing the funeral carriage made Edmund's death undeniably real in a way that words had not. His son, who had left home just a week ago full of life and optimism about the future, was returning as a cold, still form in a coffin. "He would have been such a good king," Alexander whispered, his voice breaking slightly. "He cared so much about doing right by everyone." Queen Isabella moved to stand beside her husband, placing a gentle hand on his arm. For the first time since receiving the terrible news, she seemed to find some inner strength. "Then we must make sure his memory is honored by continuing the work he started. The programs he wanted to implement, the reforms he believed in. We can carry those forward in his name." Princess Catherine joined her parents at the window, watching as the procession approached the palace gates. "The people loved him," she said quietly. "Look how many have come to see him home. Even in death he brings the kingdom together." As the funeral carriage passed through the palace gates for the last time, Alexander realized that while his son's life had ended, the impact of Edmund's death would ripple through the kingdom for years to come. The question now was whether that impact would strengthen Valdoria or tear it apart. The morning of Prince Edmund's funeral dawned clear and cold, as if the heavens themselves had stilled to witness the kingdom's grief. Throughout Valdoria's capital city, black banners hung from every window and doorway. Shopkeepers had closed their businesses, farmers had left their fields, and people from the furthest provinces had traveled for days to pay their final respects to the prince, who would never become their king. King Alexander stood before his mirror, adjusting the ceremonial sword that he had worn to only the most solemn state occasions. His reflection showed a man who seemed to have aged years in just 3 days. The silver in his hair appeared more prominent, the lines around his eyes deeper, and his shoulders carried a weight that went far beyond the heavy royal robes of mourning. Queen Isabella entered their chambers, her black dress simple but elegant, her usually perfect hair styled more severely than usual. She had regained much of her composure over the past day, transforming her private grief into the public dignity required of a queen facing her people during their darkest hour. "The cathedral square is already filled," she reported quietly. "Lord Chancellor Hartwell estimates that over 50,000 people have gathered, with more still arriving from the outer provinces." Alexander nodded, though the thought of facing such a massive crowd while wrestling with his own grief felt overwhelming. Edmund would be amazed to see how much he was loved. He always worried that he was too young, too inexperienced to earn the people's respect. He earned it through kindness and genuine concern for their welfare, Isabella replied. The farmers remember how he worked alongside them during the drought 3 years ago. The merchants remember how he simplified trade regulations to help small businesses. The teachers remember his education reforms. Princess Catherine appeared in the doorway, dressed in elegant black velvet, her usually wild curls tamed into a formal arrangement. Despite her scholarly nature and preference for solitude, she had transformed into a pillar of quiet strength for her parents. The Archbishop is ready and the honor guard has assembled. Captain Morrison is prepared to deliver his account of the mission's success as you requested. The decision to have Captain Morrison speak had been Alexander's idea. He wanted the kingdom to know that Edmund had died returning from a diplomatic triumph, not a failure. The trade agreement with Astoria would benefit thousands of citizens, and it was important that they understood their prince had given his life while serving their interests. The royal family made their way through the palace corridors, past portraits of previous kings and queens who had ruled Valdoria for centuries. Alexander found himself wondering what his ancestors would have done in his situation. Had any of them lost an heir so unexpectedly? How had they found the strength to continue ruling when personal tragedy threatened to overwhelm their public duties? As they emerged from the palace and walked toward the cathedral square, the magnitude of the gathering became apparent. The massive open space, which could comfortably hold 10,000 people during festivals, was packed beyond capacity. Citizens stood shoulder to shoulder, creating a sea of black clothing that stretched far beyond the formal boundaries of the square. Temporary platforms had been erected so that those in the back could see and hear the ceremony. The ornate coffin, carved from ancient Valdorian oak and adorned with the royal crest, sat on a raised platform in the center of the square. It was surrounded by thousands of flowers, letters, and small gifts from citizens who wanted to offer something to their departed prince. A young girl had left a drawing of Edmund on horseback. An elderly craftsman had carved a small wooden crown. A group of school children had written a collective letter thanking the prince for the new school he had helped establish in their village. Alexander took his place on the royal platform, looking out over the massive crowd. He saw faces from every level of society. Nobles in expensive mourning attire standing next to farmers in their simple best clothes, wealthy merchants beside working-class artisans, elderly citizens who remembered Edmund's birth, and young people who had grown up admiring his progressive ideals. Archbishop Benedict, a man who had served the royal family for over 20 years, began the ceremony with a voice that carried clearly across the silent crowd. We gather today not only to mourn the loss of Prince Edmund, but to celebrate a life lived in service to others. Though his time with us was shorter than we hoped, the impact of his compassion and dedication will echo through our kingdom for generations. Captain Morrison stepped forward to address the crowd, his uniform bearing the signs of his recent ordeal, but his voice strong and clear. Prince Edmund died returning from a successful mission that will bring prosperity to our kingdom. His final words to me were concerns about whether the new trade agreements would truly benefit the common citizens, not just the wealthy merchants. Even facing danger, he thought first of you, his people. The captain's words brought tears to many eyes, but also murmurs of appreciation. Knowing that Edmund had died while working for their benefit gave meaning to the tragedy, transforming it from a senseless accident into a sacrifice made for the greater good. When it came time for Alexander to speak, he approached the podium with legs that felt unsteady. Looking out over the vast crowd of his subjects, he saw their expectant faces and realized that they needed him to be strong, to provide leadership even in the midst of his own devastation. My son Edmund was not just a prince, Alexander began, his voice carrying across the silent square. He was a servant of this kingdom and its people. He believed that those born to privilege have an obligation to use that privilege to lift others up. He believed that a true ruler must understand the lives of common citizens, not just the concerns of nobles and advisors. The king paused, gathering strength from the attentive faces before him. Edmund's death leaves a void in our family and in our kingdom that can never be filled. But his vision for Valdoria, a land where opportunity exists for all, where justice is fair and accessible, where the powerful protect rather than exploit the powerless, that vision must not die with him. As Alexander spoke, he began to understand something that had been unclear during his private grief. His son's death was not just a personal loss. It was a crisis that would test the very foundations of the kingdom. The question of succession, which had seemed settled for 34 years, was now wide open. Princess Catherine had never expressed interest in ruling, and she remained unmarried with no children to continue the royal line. After the formal ceremony concluded, as the crowd began to slowly disperse, Lord Chancellor Hartwell approached the royal family with an expression of deep concern. "Your Majesty, we must discuss the matter of succession soon. Already I have received inquiries from several noble houses, as well as messages from neighboring kingdoms expressing concerns about Valdoria's stability." Alexander looked back at his son's coffin, soon to be entombed in the royal mausoleum beside generations of previous rulers. "Give us a week to grieve, William. After that, we will face whatever comes next." But even as he spoke the words, Alexander knew that the hardest challenges lay ahead. Edmund's death had not only shattered his family, it had thrown the future of the entire kingdom into question. The mourning period would end, but the consequences of this tragedy would reshape Valdoria in ways none of them could yet imagine. As the royal family returned to the palace, walking past the thousands of flowers and tributes left by their subjects, Alexander realized that the boy he had raised to be king was gone. But the kingdom Edmund had loved so deeply would need to find new leadership to carry on his legacy. In the weeks following Prince Edmund's funeral, Valdoria Palace fell into a strange rhythm of muted activity. The formal mourning period meant that court functions were suspended, social events canceled, and the usual bustling energy of royal life replaced by hushed conversations and careful footsteps. Yet beneath this surface quiet, undercurrents of political concern grew stronger each day. King Alexander found himself unable to engage with even the most basic royal duties. Documents requiring his signature piled up on his desk, provincial reports went unread, and diplomatic correspondence remained unanswered. Lord Chancellor Hartwell had taken on an increasing load of administrative responsibilities, but there were decisions that only the king could make, and Alexander seemed incapable of making them. "Your Majesty," Hartwell said during one of their morning meetings, his voice carrying a note of gentle urgency, "the ambassador from Celestine has been waiting for your response regarding the border dispute for 2 weeks. The situation requires immediate attention." Alexander stared at the map spread across his desk, showing the contested region where 2 provinces claimed the same fertile valley. Before Edmund's death, such matters had engaged his sharp political mind. Now he struggled to care about boundaries and treaties when his son would never see them resolved. What would Edmund have advised? Alexander asked, his voice hollow. Prince Edmund would have suggested a mediation council with representatives from both provinces, Hartwell replied carefully. He believed that most conflicts could be resolved through dialogue rather than royal decree. The mention of his son's diplomatic philosophy brought tears to Alexander's eyes. Everything reminded him of Edmund. Every policy decision, every state function, every conversation about the kingdom's future. The prince had been so deeply involved in governance that his absence created gaps in every aspect of royal administration. Meanwhile, Princess Catherine had begun spending more time in discussions with various court advisors and provincial representatives. Initially, these conversations had focused on condolences and shared memories of Edmund, but gradually they had evolved into something more substantial. Catherine found herself asking questions about agricultural policies, educational reforms, and economic development topics that had never particularly interested her during her brother's lifetime, Lord Chancellor Hartwell noticed this shift and mentioned it to Queen Isabella during one of their private consultations about the kingdom's management. Princess Catherine has been requesting briefing materials about several ongoing royal initiatives. She seems genuinely interested in understanding how the kingdom functions. Isabella looked up from her embroidery, the first creative work she had attempted since Edmund's death. Catherine has always been intelligent, but she preferred academic pursuits to practical governance. Perhaps losing Edmund has made her realize that someone from the royal family needs to understand these matters. Has she expressed any interest in considering succession? Hartwell asked delicately. Not directly, Isabella replied, but I've noticed her reading some of the same policy papers that Edmund used to study. She's also been asking questions about the constitutional requirements for royal inheritance. These conversations were happening throughout the palace, though never directly with the king himself. Alexander remained so consumed by grief that approaching him about succession felt cruel and premature. Yet the kingdom's business could not wait indefinitely for its ruler to recover from personal loss. The pressure for resolution came from an unexpected source. Duke Reginald of Westmarch, one of the most powerful nobles in the kingdom, requested an audience that Alexander could not postpone indefinitely. The Duke was known for his political ambitions and had often clashed with Edmund over policies favoring common citizens over noble privileges. "Your Majesty," Duke Reginald said during their meeting, his tone respectful but firm, "I offer my deepest condolences for Prince Edmund's untimely death. However, the kingdom requires clarity about the future. Other nobles, as well as our neighboring kingdoms, are beginning to question Valdoria's stability." Alexander looked at the Duke with tired eyes. "What exactly are you suggesting, Reginald?" "Princess Catherine has never shown interest in ruling, and she remains unmarried with no immediate prospect of producing an heir," the Duke replied. "Perhaps it is time to consider alternative arrangements. The Royal Council could assume greater governing responsibilities, or we might look to more distant royal relations who could provide stable succession." The suggestion that Catherine might be bypassed entirely sparked something in Alexander that grief had dampened. "Princess Catherine is my daughter and Edmund's sister. If she chooses to claim her inheritance, no one has the authority to prevent it." "Of course not, Your Majesty," Duke Reginald said smoothly, but choice is the crucial word. "If she does not choose to rule, then other arrangements must be made for the kingdom's welfare." After the Duke left, Alexander sat alone in his study, wrestling with concerns he had tried to avoid. Catherine had indeed never expressed desire for the crown, preferring her books and scholarly pursuits to the demands of monarchy. But who else could he trust with Edmund's legacy? The idea of distant cousins or ambitious nobles taking control of the kingdom Edmund had loved so deeply felt like a betrayal of his son's memory. That evening, Alexander made a decision that surprised even himself. He sought out Catherine in the palace library, where she was reading through agricultural reports from the southern provinces. "Father," she said, looking up from her papers with concern, "you look tired. Are you sleeping at all?" "Very little," he admitted, settling into the chair beside her desk. "Catherine, I need to ask you something important, and I want you to answer honestly." She set down her papers and gave him her full attention. "Of course. If Edmund were still alive, what would you be doing with your life? What were your plans for your future?" Catherine considered the question seriously. "I had thought about traveling, perhaps studying at the great universities in other kingdoms. I wanted to write about philosophy and literature, maybe contribute to scholarly discussions about governance and society. And now, with Edmund gone, have those plans changed?" She was quiet for a long moment, her fingers tracing the edges of the agricultural report she had been studying. "I keep thinking about all the projects Edmund was working on. The education reforms, the programs to help farmers during poor harvest years, the judicial changes to ensure fair treatment for common citizens. Someone needs to continue that work. It doesn't have to be you, Catherine. There are other ways to ensure Edmund's policies continue." "But would they?" she asked, meeting his eyes directly. "Would Duke Reginald or the other nobles really care about establishing schools in rural villages or protecting workers' rights? Or would they focus on policies that benefit people like themselves?" Alexander saw something in his daughter's expression that he had never noticed before. A quiet determination that reminded him strongly of Edmund, though manifested in a different way. Where Edmund had been charismatic and outgoing, Catherine possessed a thoughtful intensity that might be equally effective for leadership. "Catherine," he said carefully, "I will not pressure you to accept responsibilities you don't want, but if you do decide that you want to continue Edmund's work, you would have my complete support." "I need time to think," she replied. "This isn't a decision to make lightly." "No," Alexander agreed, "but it may be a decision that needs to be made soon. The kingdom cannot remain in uncertainty indefinitely." As father and daughter sat together in the quiet library, both understood that they stood at a crossroads that would determine not only their family's future, but the future of everyone in Valdoria. The choice Catherine made in the coming days would either honor Edmund's memory by continuing his vision, or allow that vision to die with him. 3 months after Prince Edmund's tragic death, The first signs of spring began to appear in the palace gardens. Delicate green buds emerged from bare branches, and early flowers pushed through the dark soil, creating small patches of color against the winter-worn landscape. The cycle of renewal felt both comforting and painful to King Alexander, who watched from his study window as life persistently continued despite devastating loss. The formal mourning period had ended, but the royal family remained forever changed. Alexander had gradually begun to resume his duties, though he approached them with a different perspective than before. Every policy decision was now filtered through the question of how Edmund would have handled the situation, and this constant reference to his son's memory had actually improved his leadership in unexpected ways. Princess Catherine had spent weeks in deep contemplation, consulting with advisors, reading extensively about royal history, and traveling quietly to different provinces to observe the kingdom's needs firsthand. Her scholarly approach to understanding governance had revealed insights that surprised even seasoned court officials. She possessed an analytical mind that could see connections between policies and their long-term consequences in ways that complemented her father's more intuitive leadership style. A crisp morning in early spring, Catherine requested a formal meeting with her parents in the throne room. This was unusual, as family discussions typically took place in private chambers, but she had specifically asked for the formal setting. Alexander and Isabella exchanged concerned glances as they took their places on the twin thrones they had occupied for over 30 years. Catherine entered wearing a simple but elegant blue dress, her hair arranged in the formal style typically reserved for state occasions. She carried herself with a new dignity that marked a subtle but significant transformation from the scholarly princess who had preferred libraries to throne rooms. "Father, Mother," she began, her voice clear and steady, "I have given careful consideration to our kingdom's needs and to my own capabilities and desires. I have a decision to announce." Alexander felt his heart racing, though he maintained his composed exterior. The kingdom had been waiting for this moment, and whatever Catherine decided would reshape Valdoria's future. "I have decided to accept the responsibilities of royal succession," Catherine declared, "not because I have always dreamed of ruling, but because I believe I can continue the work that Edmund began and serve our people in the way they deserve." The relief that flooded through Alexander was immediately followed by pride. His daughter had not made this decision lightly or out of family obligation, but from a genuine desire to serve others, exactly the motivation that had driven Edmund throughout his life. Queen Isabella smiled through tears of mixed sorrow and joy. "Are you certain, my dear? This is not a path you can easily abandon once you begin walking it." "I am certain," Catherine replied firmly, "but I want to do this differently than traditional succession planning. I don't want to simply wait for father's eventual retirement or death. I want to begin taking on significant responsibilities now, learning through active participation rather than theoretical preparation." This proposal intrigued Alexander. "What exactly do you have in mind?" "I want to be appointed as Royal Minister of Domestic Affairs," Catherine said. "Give me authority over education, agriculture, social welfare, and judicial reform, the areas where Edmund was making the most progress. Let me prove that I can handle real responsibility before I inherit the entire kingdom." The idea was unprecedented, but brilliant. Rather than the traditional model where heirs remained largely ceremonial until succession, Catherine was proposing to earn her eventual crown through demonstrated competence. It would give the kingdom confidence in her abilities, while allowing Alexander to gradually transition responsibilities rather than carrying the full load alone. Lord Chancellor Hartwell, who had been consulted about this plan in advance, stepped forward with prepared documents. "The constitutional precedent supports such an arrangement, Your Majesty. Several previous monarchs have appointed family members to significant administrative roles during their reigns." Over the following months, Catherine's appointment transformed both her personal development and the kingdom's governance. She approached each responsibility with the thoroughness of a scholar, but the practical wisdom of someone who understood that policies affected real people's lives. Her educational reforms expanded literacy programs throughout rural areas. Her agricultural initiatives helped small farmers adopt new techniques that increased crop yields while protecting the environment. Most significantly, Catherine established what became known as Prince Edmund Memorial Programs, initiatives that directly continued the work her brother had begun. New schools were built in his name, judicial reforms were implemented according to his proposals, and economic development programs focused on creating opportunities for common citizens rather than just enriching the wealthy. Alexander found that sharing responsibilities with his daughter had rekindled his own enthusiasm for leadership. Catherine's fresh perspective challenged him to reconsider long-standing policies, while his experience provided guidance for her innovative ideas. Together, they formed a more effective leadership team than either could have been alone. The kingdom responded positively to these changes. Citizens appreciated seeing tangible progress on issues that affected their daily lives, and knowing that Prince Edmund's vision lived on through his sister's work provided a sense of continuity and hope. The tragedy that had once threatened to destabilize Valdoria had instead catalyzed positive transformation. 1 year after Edmund's death, the royal family held a memorial service at the site where he had died. The collapsed bridge had been rebuilt as a magnificent structure called Prince Edmund's Crossing, and the surrounding area had been developed into a peaceful memorial garden where travelers could rest and remember the prince who had died serving his people. Standing beside the new bridge, King Alexander reflected on the strange alchemy by which devastating loss had ultimately strengthened rather than destroyed his family and kingdom. Edmund would never return, and that absence would always cause pain, but his influence continued to shape Valdoria in positive ways. Princess Catherine, now widely respected as the kingdom's future queen, had grown into a leader who combined compassion with competence, scholarship with practical wisdom. She would rule differently than Edmund would have, but she would rule well, guided by the same principles of service and genuine care for others that had defined her brother's too brief life. Queen Isabella had channeled her grief into charitable work, establishing foundations that supported families who had lost breadwinners in accidents or disasters. Her personal experience of loss had given her a unique ability to comfort others facing similar tragedies. As the memorial service concluded and the royal family returned to their carriage, Alexander realized that they had not simply survived their darkest hour. They had been transformed by it into better versions of themselves. The king who had once ruled through strength alone now led with deeper empathy. The princess who had once avoided responsibility had embraced it with wisdom beyond her years. The queen who had once focused on ceremony had discovered the power of direct service to those in need. Edmund's death would always represent a profound loss, but it had also become the foundation for a legacy that would benefit countless future generations. In learning to honor their grief while continuing to serve others, the royal family of Valdoria had discovered that even the deepest sorrow can ultimately give rise to hope, strength, and renewed purpose. The kingdom Edmund had loved was in capable hands, guided by the values he had embodied and the love he had inspired in those who survived him.